smell of gunpowder is almost still hanging in the air just 2 years after the Battle of Gate Pa in Tauranga, and men are scrabbling around the landscape, measuring and apportioning that land out. These were the district surveyors of Tauranga. Hi, I'm Harley Couper, a heritage specialist at Tauranga City Libraries, and today we'll be looking at some of those letters those men were writing. When Henry Skeets wrote to Colonel Harrington asking for revolvers and breech loaders for his surveyors, he had no idea that the ink and the paper he was writing would last 150 years. Today, those letters are not just letters, they're now part of an archive. Henry Skeets' letter, in fact, all the letters from the district surveyors were copied and collected into a single book, and this book sits within our temperature-controlled fireproof room here in Ngā Wāhi Rangahau o Te Ao Marama ki Te Papa, the research collections at Tauranga City Libraries.
Hi, I'm Abby Wharne and I'm an archivist here at Tauranga City Libraries, and today I'm going to be talking about the Surveyor's Letter Book, which dates from 1866 to 1868 and is one of the art items in our archive collections. From the outside, these boxes may look a little drab, but inside they contain material that is rich in the history of Tauranga Moana. Because they are so rare and precious, they require special handling and care. Every time a collection is entrusted or gifted to Tauranga City Libraries, the material within it is rehoused in acid-free containers. These containers are then stored on metal shelves. This is because wood and paper made from wood pulp is acidic, and we really want to avoid our collections coming into contact with this material. We also use data loggers to log the temperature and humidity in our space, because we don't want it to be too damp or too hot in here. And every time we handle something, we make sure we do so in a way that will not damage it. In short, our priority is to make sure that this material will last for generations to come.
Digitalisation is another tool that helps us preserve kaitiaki, the original letters from Henry Skeets and others. These assets can be made available online, and they will be made available online towards the end of 2020. That gives people access who want to research and look at them, and it also means that our originals get looked at and handled less often. So that's a win-win for us. We look after the originals, we make them available to others. Henry Skeets' letter to Colonel Harrington, in fact all of his letters and the letters of his colleagues, are one of those digital assets that will be available towards the end of 2020.
As a record of colonisation, the letter book is confronting. Personally, I find it difficult to read. While I'm interested and intrigued by descriptions of the place I call home, I'm also faced with the cruel assumptions made by the surveyors whose work is documented in this book. Through this short film, we hope to offer a brief introduction to this complex item through three key themes. The surveying and mapping of land referred to in this letter book naturally reflects a Western colonial worldview. When we think of modern maps, we picture helpful resources that help us get from A to B. The plans referred to in this book were about much more than this. A driving force behind their creation was the desire to create European settlements in this area. As such, they can be considered as tools of colonisation. Maori living in Tauranga in the 1860s would have viewed the land very differently from the surveyors, whose work is also documented in this map from the 1880s, which is held by Auckland City Libraries. We can see that place names were changed, and geographical features that didn't fit the surveyor's idea of what was useful were either disregarded or altered to suit need. The way a society sees something impacts the way it acts. Consequently, the landscape changed dramatically through the surveyor's work. Hills were flattened, wetlands were drained, fern and bush cleared, and roadways were imagined and marked out.
In December 1866, Henry Skeet writes about some of the challenges to the landscape, and we have that letter within the surveyor's letterbooks. I'll read some of that letter now. In reference to the Provincial Surveyor Memo 1866-801, the surveyor in charge would explain that His Excellency the Governor requested the plans from the Survey Office at Tauranga to be laid before him. From the delineations of Mr. Wilkinson's plan and Colonel Harrington's explanations, he ascertained that a large quantity of the land was very bad. In this district, the cases of rejection is not as in the Waikato swamp, but the country is everywhere intersected by most precipitous gullies, totally impassable and ranging from 20 to 70 chains in width. The ground in the vicinity being also very broken and only available land being on the plateau or high flats between the gullies. The major roads have generally been taken in the best places, but the surveyor in charge has found it necessary to alter the main road at the southern extremity of Mr. Wilkinson's survey. An alteration was previously made by order of the late district surveyor, carrying the road over a steep gully, when it might have been continued on level land. In many instances, the plain roads must cross gullies, as for instance at Paingaroa, Te Tawhiti, Kahakaharoa, and one or two other places. Henry Skeet, Tauranga District Surveyor.
Here and throughout the letterbook, there is no mention of what the land meant to local iwi, or what drawing boundaries or marking out roads would have affected their relationship with the land. For the surveyors, land was something to be tamed. It didn't have history or genealogy, it was just something to be altered to suit their own purposes. In this letter, dated 20th of June 1866, Frederick Utting, who was a district surveyor at the time, refers to the first plans for the town lots. We get a sense through his writing that he wants to create something that is very reminiscent of what he would call home.
Survey Office, June 20, 1866 memo. I enclose tracing of the plan of town lots with the numbers of allotments. I have made some slight alterations in the arrangement of lots 34 to 37 in order to suit the ground better. Also in lots 12 to 15 so as to contain the present buildings in separate lots. The lower part of the reserved square will form an excellent marketplace, and the site of the redoubt, when no longer required for its present purposes, will be an admirable situation for a church or town hall. If the lower end of the open square is to be permanently reserved, numbers 1 and 2 would be the most suitable site for the custom house. Number 113, I would suggest, should be reserved for a mechanics institute. I would also suggest that numbers 29 to 33 surrounding Colonel Hamilton's house should be reserved for the present. Other reserves for religious purposes I think might be made when a further extension of the township is made. The most suitable site for a wharf is opposite the street which I have marked Hamilton Street.
For me, there's something a little uncanny about these early letters. Perhaps it's a combination of strange yet familiar. We definitely begin to see Tauranga as we would recognise it today. The road and layout of the land begins to take shape. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, what seems so familiar to us today would have seemed very alien to Maori living in Tauranga in the 1860s, particularly the Western concepts of individual land ownership, drawing boundaries, and land confiscation. Reading these letters makes me wonder, Did the surveyors know the lasting impact of their actions? Was this their intention? Did they care about or even consider how their actions would have affected Maori living in Tauranga at this time, the carving up of their land? Or were they so blinded by their assumptions and thinking that what they were doing was for the best? Our final theme is a history of struggle. Today, when we think of a surveyor, we might think of a man wearing a high-vis suit, standing on the roadside looking through a theodolite. But the men working in the 1860s and described in this letterbook were very different.
Looking into the background of these surveys, we see something quite different to a modern tradie. The first surveyor was Frederick Utting, the second was Horatio Wharne, who had been a Royal Engineer, a professional soldier. He'd also been a senior sergeant in the Auckland Rifle Volunteers and had fought in the Taranaki land wars. The third district surveyor was Henry Skeets, who we've already met. And at this time, Henry had just formed the Auckland Volunteer Engineer Corps. Some of the soldiers within Henry's corps included names like Edward Trigger, Henry Graham, Thomas Jordan, G.T. Wilkinson and William Gundry. And these are the very names littered throughout the surveyor letters. William Gundry, someone with Māori and Pākehā tupuna, had himself been at Rangiriri and Ōrākau. He would later make captain himself and eventually serve within the Armed Constabulary, a precursor to the New Zealand Police Service. So in short, these were military men, capable of acting in an organised manner to execute their mandate with force and violence if necessary. But they were also more than military men. Among them were future scholars, magistrates, county council mayors and native land court judges. These were people who were personally invested in the successful imposition of colonial rule within New Zealand. These were men often capable of conversing in te reo. They had Māori friends, acquaintances, even an admiration for Māori. Yet they still assumed that Pākehā ways were normal. Pākehā needs and wants were more important, and Pākehā society was the society that was to be imprinted on this place. It's the presence and power of these assumptions that I find confronting. These men had a dogged, determined, unquestioning commitment to grinding a Pākehā mind into the landscape and into the lives of all who call Aotearoa New Zealand home. They were part of what Reverend Alfred Brown had anxiously predicted 30 years earlier when he talked about a springtide violence. Brown, writing to his employers back home in England, writes, "And in a little while, this fine country will probably change masters, and the New Zealanders be added to the list of nations that have withered before the blasting influence of colonisation." It's telling then that this reprint from the Royal Engineers Journal has a romantic map of a surveyor standing by his theodolite, dressed in military clothes with a rifle slung over his shoulder. It's not surprising then that we see through these survey letters glimpses of struggle and resistance.
An example of this resistance and struggle is this letter sent on the very first day of 1867 from District Surveyor Henry Skeets to Chief Surveyor Major Charles Heafy. My dear Sir, I have the honour to report that Mr. Graham arrived at Tauranga last week. As soon as he had collected his stores, etc., I forwarded them in a boat to the ford at Waimapu. I provided a pack horse to transport them to Ōrapi. On Saturday, I went up to the camp about a quarter of a mile behind Ōrapi, and in the afternoon went with Mr. Graham over some of the lines. On Sunday, whilst at dinner with Mr. Graham, 2 or 3 natives came up to the camp bringing Mr. Beers and stating that the ho-hos were coming and begging us to return to Te Papa. We at first thought it was only a scheme to get possession of the stores, etc., but individual natives, in a great state of excitement, kept dropping to the camp, saying that the ho-hos were coming close. The men were fortunately at the Waimapu, having gone down with a pack horse, only one European being with Mr. Graham at the time, whom we sent away immediately. I stated my intention to remain, but Robert, a native of Oropi, begged me not to do so, as these were bad men and he could not protect even my life. Mr. Graham himself then retired, and I dispatched a messenger to Te Ranapia at Arini and returned to Te Papa. Te Rangapia himself went up to Europe and returned on Monday evening. His report, translated by Mr. Warbrick, is enclosed. Further details of this account made the newspapers on January the 19th, 1867. The Bay of Plenty Times hadn't been established by this point, so you can read about it in the Nelson Examiner. Local libraries working with the National Library of New Zealand had digitised many of their newspaper collections up until the 1950s. These are available on a website called Papers Past.
Through these survey letters, we see a glimpse of the pushback from Māori to the enormous social upheaval that was underway for them. The recent land wars, confiscations, disease, a relentless tide of European immigration, enormous pressure to purchase and individuate land title had been experienced as a kind of cultural violence, as withering as the crimping of an umbilical cord. It was a shock wave that never dissipated, a concussion visited upon generation after generation. And our collection contains many works that describe and document the impact of this period of time on Māori today and in the past. Let's look at some of the early primary and secondary resources that relate to the confiscation, the raupatu. Because the raupatu was largely the weaponising of a legal framework in order to obtain land, large swathes of land were confiscated from Māori who hadn't fought against the British, who had even supported the British. The government had adopted a guilty until proven innocent stance, and that transferred the battle to the legal court system. Out of these legal battles came documents, testimony, claims, statutes, studies, and these have been collected over time and formed into the Raupatu Document Bank. The result is numerous documents relating to claims, reports, statutes and other material from the 1870s as late as the 1960s. These mostly handwritten accounts have been collected into the Raupatu Document Bank and are a valuable source of knowledge containing the early korero of those first generations contesting for their land.
A second key resource are the minutes that came out of these court cases. The korero given in open court was often written down by those attending the hearing, and these are in various whānau collections throughout the country. But there were also official court minutes. An index to these minutes is available online, and the minutes themselves, handwritten accounts in te reo, are available from the Maori Land Court. Tauranga City Library has the Tauranga Claims collection digitally on site, as well as many physically as well. As at July 2020, we are the only local public library to have their region's early Maori Land Court minutes. We make these available on site only via this laptop. More recent cases under the Waitangi tribunals have produced another wealth of korero as part of the Tauranga Moana Y215 claims, the Y2849 Hauraki claims, and the Heritage New Zealand reports. These documents include claims, papers in proceedings, research commissions, transcripts and translations. Impact reports and evidential briefings are also available to researchers digitally on this laptop here within Ngā Wāhi Rangahau, along with many archaeological reports.
Documents like the surveyor letter books have travelled 150 years through time to be with us today. Through these resources, we get to see some of the korero and accounts of this era. We get to see something of how our region and our people used to be. Their hopes and plans, desires and fears. It helps us understand something of our own today, our willingness to see the past, our capacity to imagine the future.